Good morning. My name is Rebecca Narragon. I am the Director for USET's Office of Economic Development. You are joining today's webinar on the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. On September 20th, 2021, Treasury launched the Capital Projects Fund and has calculated a per tribal nation allocation based on the total number of federally recognized tribal nations. Under this allocation methodology, Treasury has determined that $167,504 will be allocated to each tribal nation, with the goal to assist with the critical capital projects that directly enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. The deadline to apply for the Capital Projects Fund is June 1st of this year, but we know that there is a lot to consider before accepting these dollars or submitting proposals, applications. So we wanted to make this time available to you and your staff. Today's speakers are Gina and Eric with Tetra Tech, a firm who has done a lot of work in the ARPA and CARES recovery programs. The scheduled presentation this morning does not constitute an endorsement or recommendations by USET. All information provided either before or we'll make sure that a copy of these presentation slides are available after is for information purposes only. But Eric and Gina and others from their team will be available for any follow-up conversations, follow-up questions that you might have. So with that, I would like to pass the presentation sort of reins over to Gina. The remaining schedule or the agenda for today, it will be a traditional webinar where Gina and Eric will have a presentation slides to go over, and there will be a question and answer time afterwards. This session is being available after today. A link will be sent out to all participants. So if you have other team members that you would like to hear what is being we'll make that will be available. So thank you so much for everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Be on the lookout. Last housekeeping note, be on the lookout in the chat box for a link for an evaluation survey so we can collect your thoughts of how today's session went and collect any ideas or proposals for presentations. Thanks again, and Gina, feel free to get started. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. It's an honor to be speaking to you and the USET members today about the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund presentation specifically for tribal governments and oriented towards these benefits. I am Gina Bainfelt, Vice President Economic Development Services with Tetra Tech. I've been with the company about 6 years and have over 30 years, a little hard to say, of experience developing and implementing successful programs to support growth of communities and businesses. I am the long-term recovery and economic development practice lead for Tetra Tech's company-wide emergency management community resilience initiative, which is a group of several hundred staff skilled in disaster recovery and disaster response and planning from the day after the event occurs through the long-term, long tail of recovery, as well as the many planning exercises and trainings in between. I have been involved in implementation of well over $1 billion in financing, grants, tax incentives, in particular experience in U.S. Economic Development Administration, USEDA, Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, and that's disaster recovery and mitigation, U.S. Small Business Administration, New Markets Tax Credits, Opportunity Zones, and State Small Business Credit Initiative, among many local and state funding and financing sources. Much of my days these days are involved in assisting our clients in developing plans and supporting their deployment of American Rescue Plan Act, state and local financial recovery fund dollars. So I will turn to Eric, who will introduce ourselves and we'll give a little bit of an overview and then really get into it. Eric.
Thank you very much, Gina. As Gina stated, my name is Eric Jenga. I'm a senior planner with Tetra Tech. I have more than 20 years community and economic planning experience, and that's included a lot of your standard work, things such as developing comprehensive plans, redevelopment plans, zoning and codes, things of that nature. But a lot of my work is specialized in assisting counties and communities and states with federally funded programs. A lot of those programs have been through Department of Housing and Urban Development, through HUD and their CDBG program and home program. But in recent years, it's really been much more focused on a lot of disaster recovery, including CDBG-GR, CDBG-MIT, the mitigation funds, CARES Act, ARPA. And a lot of the support that I've provided to folks has really been in regards to compliance, development of policies and procedures, managing those programs. And so that's been a real big focus, is just keeping everything in compliance and assisting folks along when it comes to federally funded programs. The disaster recovery work I've been working on has been coast to coast. It's been all over the country. And, you know, have been providing ongoing support in regards to the ARPA and general COVID recovery funding and activities that's been going on. My family, we are also members of the Choctaw Nation. My brother and my father both have their tribal recognition out of Oklahoma. And I grew up on the Navajo Indian Reservation. When I was younger, both my parents were teachers there. So, yeah, there's that as well. But yeah, so that's enough of me. Go ahead, Gina.
Great, thanks, Eric. He is a real go-to subject matter expert in federal funding and compliance within Tetra Tech. So it's my great pleasure to work with Eric. Today, in regard to the Capital Project Fund, we're going to do a few chief things. Our slides are a little bit dense, but they are also intended to be that way, to provide a little more color, a little more explanation as a quick resource guide for use of the funds. So we'll talk a bit about the purpose of the funds. I'll take the first couple of slides and then Eric will dive into much more of the details. We will talk about funding access and the application process, timing and compliance briefly, as guidance is not quite out yet. And then those important considerations around project design, how to use the funds most effectively, most efficiently, given their scale and potentials, eligible uses. So with that, as you are all very aware, the American Rescue Plan Act authorized $1.9 trillion. These days, we're talking about T's in front of our federal funding in March of last year, and $10 billion under the State and Local Financial Recovery Fund in May through US Treasury, with July interim rules and just the December final rules. So be aware there, those have been issued. Then within ARPA is also $100 million under this capital projects fund, with each tribal government, as Rebecca mentioned, being allocated $167,504. So not a huge amount, but there's still some usefulness here. as well as simply wishing to take every dollar that's on the table and make good use of it. The purpose, generally speaking, is to carry out capital projects that directly enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Straightforward. Emphasis is on funding for broadband infrastructure, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the dollar amounts for tribal governments are a little lower, because there have been so many significant dollars to support broadband infrastructure under other programs. Couple of key thoughts here. So again, as you make use of the PowerPoint, this is a great slide. These are actual hot links to the Capital Projects Fund for tribal governments. They're kind of two sections, the general and one for tribal governments. Make sure you're in the right section, but this link will bring you there. There's funding guidance, frequently asked questions, great tool. The application checklist, which we're going to go a little bit into the details around the application, and a sample capital projects fund application. So some really good, useful resources there. And then in terms of the funding objectives, Eric, I think this is, we agreed this would be your slide, so I will turn it to you.
All right. Thank you, Gina. So as you can see, there are some general funding objectives intended with the CPF. Some of the key items here is that the objectives being the improvement of infrastructure necessary, and the key that needs to be remembered in regards to a lot of these projects is the language involving participation in work, education, and health monitoring. So that's one of the funding objectives, but they would also like, the Department of Treasury would also like those investments to last beyond just the pandemic. So we're looking at trying to make these features resilient, redundant, so things of that nature, just to make them last. Looking to support projects that are designed specifically to address inequities in access to services. Equity has Department of Treasury with a lot of their ARPA funds. Equity has been a very big focus, and it continues to be with these funds as well. And the additional objective of supporting the provision of modern infrastructure to access those critical services, with that major focus on broadband internet connectivity. So you're going to hear a lot of information regarding broadband, but these funds really are focused on building new or expanding upon broadband connectivity. Project eligibility, all projects have to meet the following criteria. So they do have to all meet these three items. Must invest in capital asset designed to directly enable work, education, health monitoring. Has to address a critical need that resulted from COVID-19. There has to be some sort of a tieback as an impact from the COVID-19 pandemic. And there has to be a direct connection between the critical need and the community being served. So and that impact from the COVID-19, the community it's in is also where the service or facilities are being provided. Side note, funds can be awarded to subrecipients. Some tribal governments can set up a subrecipient agreement. So that's just something to keep in mind as you move forward with using these funds. So go ahead, Gina, next slide. So there's essentially two sorts of eligibility when it comes to projects. The first are those that are considered presumptively eligible projects. These are the ones that we certainly recommend if you can design projects and find projects that fit within these presumptive definitions. We would highly recommend it. It will streamline your application process. They're already considered eligible by just in the name. So you don't have to provide a lot of support documentation, things of that nature in regards to the application process. So that being said, the presumptively eligible projects include purchasing and improving broadband infrastructure. And so that includes providing services to areas without reliable quality service. So it can be the creation of new service, or if there's substandard service in place, upgrading that service. There are some requirements in regards to the quality and capacity when it comes to broadband infrastructure. So it has to meet or exceed download and upload speeds of 100 Mbps. However, there is some flexibility in there based on some geographic limitations and some other things, but generally those are the criteria. And again, keeping in mind that the provision of that infrastructure, it has to address a critical need within that community being served. The other eligible projects are those that include purchasing and improving digital connectivity technologies. This would be desktops, laptops, routers, Wi-Fi equipment, boosters, repeaters, anything along those lines, that equipment. There are, as you'll see on the upcoming slides, there are some details in regards to how that ownership must be retained by the grantee. But and so this would really go a lot towards school systems, education systems, getting upgraded desktops, laptops, making sure they have connectivity, making sure that the signals are strong enough, that they're consistent enough. And again, we were talking about having it work beyond the pandemic. Put redundancy in place. These funds are being made available. I would certainly recommend if there's any sort of special needs software or special needs laptops, tablets, anything that may look to try to address those with these funds. That's the intent of these funds. So really, kind of keep yourself open to taking those things into consideration. And the last item here is the multi-purpose community facility projects. Please keep in mind, again, it really does need to be a multi-purpose community facility. That can be the construction or improvement of buildings, but they have to jointly and directly, that's key, jointly and directly enable work, education, and health monitoring. So, the direct provision, it really does need to be a direct service being made available at that facility. Again, it's going to need to address critical need. All these items are going to have to address a critical need. That's going to be defined coming up. So that's going to be applicable to all these projects. Go ahead. So here's a couple of considerations in regards to the presumptively eligible projects. When it comes to broadband infrastructure, keep in mind you have to meet those minimum service standards. So if you're going to go out and look for any service providers, also taking into some other considerations such as geography and maybe some other issues that may cause interference, whatever, you are going to have to meet the minimum service standards for broadband. So make sure you keep that in mind. While there are some items to take into considerations that the Department of Treasury is strongly encouraging, but they're not required. And one of those being a priority on the development or expansion of fiber optic infrastructure. Fiber optic is extremely expensive, so there's a little bit of a limitation there with the funding amounts that are available, but that is one of the items that they're looking to prioritize. And also there was an emphasis on involving networks that are owned and operated by local governments, nonprofits, co-ops, just not necessarily defaulting to service provided by some of the large scale commercial vendors that everyone's familiar with. There really is wanting more support for smaller business, local business, things of that nature. Now, there are some items that are required. A requirement is going to be, there has to be evidence of consideration of affordability to target markets. So, if you're working in areas that have lower income or higher poverty, it really needs to be taken in consideration, the affordability. And as part of that, you have to make sure that any service providers providing broadband services have to participate in federal programs which provide low-income consumers with subsidies on the service. So if you're looking to do any sort of broadband service and you're looking at service providers, process of elimination, they have to participate in those federal programs that provide those subsidies. So keep that in mind. As I stated earlier, any of the equipment, it must be maintained by the recipient, or if you put a subrecipient agreement in place, the ownership of it has to be retained by the recipient or subrecipient. You can't give those materials away. You can't give laptops to students to own, things of that nature. And in regards to the multi-purpose community facility projects, again, I can't emphasize enough the joint and direct provision to enable work, education, and health monitoring. There's a little caveat to that as well, in that these services, enabling work, education, health monitoring, those do not need to be the exclusive function of the facility. So if the facility, by its nature, does something else, provides one of these things that's not work or education or health monitoring, or primarily only focuses on one, that's okay. But there does need to be the provision of all three of those types of services, regardless of what the primary use of that facility is. And then any of those services that are put in place, they have to be set up for 5 years. So keep that in mind when you are looking to utilize these funds, that any sort of contracting, any sort of agreements, those services need to be secured for at least 5 years in a case-by-case review. So these are projects that would not, by definition, meet the presumptive eligibility. You can certainly offer up another project. It will be reviewed in a case-by-case review. However, there are some limits on those projects, and you can see here, if you're going to invest in any sort of capital asset, it's still going to need to directly enable that work, education, health monitoring services. Again, like I was saying, it doesn't need to be the exclusive function of the facility, or even the purpose of the project, but you do have to have evidence that all three of those things are occurring. It needs to be occurring in a substantial manner, not a one-time, you can come in and get a health pamphlet on whatever it is, diabetes or whatever health thing you're working with. It needs to be the direct provision of a service. Again, any of these case-by-case projects, they have to address a need that resulted from COVID-19 pandemic, and the project has to address a critical need. So I know I've used that term several times. So critical need is defined as basically the complete absence or insufficiency of whatever the resource is, the broadband service, whatever service you're trying to address that was lacking. That's the absence of that service, or just it's insufficient provision of it, substandard quality. That defines it as critical need, as does affordability. So if there is broadband service made available, but it's just extremely expensive and thereby the cost, it's cost restrictive, that cost prohibition just does not allow for equitable use, that can also be identified as critical needs. So it has to be one of those two kind of definitions in regards to critical need. Must serve communities that lack access to the resource or services that's going to be provided. So I know that seems very intuitive, but you'd be surprised. The service has to go to the community in need. Again, making sure that critical need resulted in some sort of impediment to work, education, health monitoring. And then last, community is identified with a critical need. While I'm sure many of you are going to be looking to provide services or facility improvements to facilities and individuals located within the tribal lands, it doesn't have to be. These projects can be located off tribal lands. That's okay. But you're still going to have to meet all these other eligibility criteria in regards to critical need and work, education requirements. So, okay, those projects that are not going to be eligible: general infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, any general infrastructure, bridges, stormwater, all that. They're ineligible. That's off the table. Also, improvements to hospitals and schools are basically ineligible. However, if you can make the case-by-case case for that project eligibility, then they can be considered. So if you're looking to do an addition to a school, expand a school, build something new, maybe are constructing a school and some of these funds may pitch in on that, it can be done, but that school is going to have to meet all of those case-by-case eligibility criteria. So keep that in mind. And again, it's got to be for 5 years that's going to have to meet that and provide that service. Eligible costs with CPF funds, kind of your standard. Anyone who works with federal programs, it's your administrative costs and your project costs are your two big buckets. I just provide a little bit of information regarding administrative costs. There's sometimes some ambiguity on what exactly those are, but any technical assistance you provide, any subrecipients, compliance with grant administration, auditing requirements, all of the kind of standard administrative activities. There is a cap on administration funds, and that's 5% or $25,000, whichever is greater. Being that everyone is receiving the same amount of funds here, we just did the quick math. Your 5% would be limited to a little over $8,000. So I would greatly recommend, if you need it, to use the greater of the two, because that would give you access to substantially more administrative funds if you need that, up to $25,000. And just keep in mind that that includes both direct and indirect administrative costs. Project costs is a lot of the standard kind of items in regards to construction, acquisition of property, equipment, facilities, any of the personnel needed to carry out or construct the facility, any sort of long-term leasing that may be required in the provision of services. Two of the items that I do want to kind of emphasize is, one, you can have pre-development costs. So if you conducted any studies, and these funds can retroactively go back, there'll be a date coming up to March of 2021. So any costs incurred, those upfront pre-development costs, those are eligible under project costs, as are any cost of compliance activities. So those are going to be considered project, not administrative. So, and we'll talk a little bit about compliance coming up. So go ahead. Ineligible costs, please keep in mind, again, this is very focused on broadband. So a lot of these ineligible costs are called out specifically for those items. That would be, you can see them here, acquisition of spectrum licenses, short-term operating leases, and then a lot of these other items are just generally federal funds are not typically allowed to be used for things such as operating expenses other than grant administration, payment of interest on principal on outstanding debts, payment for legal services, things of that nature. And certainly funds cannot be used to support or oppose any sort of collective bargaining. So go ahead, next slide. Okay, so that brings us to the funding access application. Keep in mind that there is an application page, an application process in order to get access to these funds. We've provided some links here. The second link is the actual direct link to where you will find the application. You'll have to go on there and fill out some information. Go ahead, next slide. So first things first, this is verbatim for eligible tribal government to make sure everyone's aware of who within the tribal nations is considered the eligible entity in case there's any lack of clarity. Here it is here. So there's the definition of who can technically apply. And that question is the first question of the application. You have to prove that you are the tribal government entity. Keep in mind, tribal governments are not required to submit a separate grant plan or program plan like many of the other grant recipients are. So anything you've heard in regards to those plans is not applicable to tribal governments. And then here's a bunch of several key dates. Your application deadline is going to be this summer, June 1. As I was saying, the funds can be used to cover costs incurred all the way back to March 15th. So if during the pandemic, there were other studies or plans or whatever may have been done that are going to go into the provision of the service that you're looking to utilize the funds for, the CPF can actually go back and cover those costs previously incurred. Lastly, the funds must be expended and reach substantial completion by December 31st, 2026. A lot of times it'll just say expended when it comes to federal programs. Reach substantial completion means that it needs to be providing its primary service, its primary intended use is up and running at 100% by December 31st, 2026. So the house needs to be built. You can be putting up the blinds, but the house is built. Okay, it needs to be livable. You got to be in it. So that's, the project needs to be done essentially. Next slide. Okay, this is always the most fun part. I'm sure everyone's excited to hear all about compliance. So these are federal funds. They're coming through Department of Treasury. They are going to be subject to uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements of 2 CFR Part 2. All of 2 CFR Part 200 will be applicable. We're talking about things such as procurement. There's a lot of compliance language there. We didn't go into the deepest details here, but I would strongly recommend you are, very comfortable with what those 2 CFR requirements are. Davis-Bacon Act, which often applies to federally funded programs, do not apply to CPF if a project is solely funded with CPF. While you don't have to utilize Davis-Bacon, recipients are encouraged to incorporate strong labor standards. I know the funds are very limited here, but I always recommend putting together some sort of policy and procedure document in the very beginning, right up front, make it clear, staff assignments, all that. These things can be audited. There's obviously scrutiny on federal funds, especially when it comes to COVID. So, just really, I really strongly recommend being diligent about that. And any of the recommendations that Treasury provides, try to take those into account if you can. When it comes to prevailing wage, though, Davis-Bacon or state prevailing wage, they will be applicable if you marry these funds with other funds that do have any sort of prevailing wage compliance requirements. So those will then be applicable to these funds as well. They will not be excluded. So please keep that in mind. I know this is a limited amount of money, so a lot of folks may be looking to use these funds with some other funds. Keep in mind you have some compliance, ease of compliance in regards to things such as prevailing wage. So don't try, if you can, there's no reason to make it harder on yourself by adding that new requirement to these funds. If you can carve out something specific, it would just make it much, much easier, obviously. Environmental review, this is a little odd, the way that they've put this language together. Most federally funded programs require some sort of NEPA review. The language that they're including is that you need to complete the environmental checklist. The funds solely in and of themselves are indicated as not requiring NEPA, but then in the very same breath, they are giving an environmental checklist that you must complete and keep things in compliance with the recommendations within that checklist. And those items are, some of those are NEPA items. So the language is a little confusing. I would just say, stick with the checklist, and when you do your project, and just follow all the instructions that are included there. Lastly, the validation of your application, it has to be complete. All the boxes need to be checked, and then your eligibility. So those are the two key items within your application that need to be done: completeness and eligibility, and then the application will be accepted and your grant agreement will then be provided. And within that grant agreement will be much more the details regarding the specific compliance requirements. Next slide. Additionally, what should be in that grant agreement is going to be any of your reporting requirements. While reporting has been provided for a lot of other COVID recovery funding sources, the reporting for this, for CPF, the reporting language, the compliance requirements has not been released yet. So we're keeping an eye on it. The detailed reporting guidance is not out. There has been some indication as to what sort of information is going to be looked for. A lot of it follows a lot of the ARPA SLFRF sort of requirements, similar, in regards to an annual project and expenditure report. And that those reports are going to require a lot of this kind of standard items: what the project is, what the expenditures are to date, the status of the project, are there any sub-recipients? There may be some equity indicators, community engagement, civil rights items, like I said, equity, and underserved populations has really been a focus in regards to a lot of this COVID recovery. So, just keep that in mind as information about this reporting requirements starts coming down the pipeline. Next. Okay, so that's kind of the quick and dirty in regards to the program, its eligibility, the applications, the compliance. We kind of have to do a quick pass on some of those items. But with all that being said, there are some things that in regards to design of projects and some considerations that we would like to pass along. First is these are very limited funds, obviously. This is in the greater scheme of things, with the amount of money that's going around, this is pretty small. So keep that in mind when you're trying to design your program. Keep your scope limited, keep it concise, keep it very clear. There are presumptive eligibility projects. I would try to stick with those as much as possible. It makes your application much, much easier. It makes compliance much, much easier. Management, because there's clear definitions on what those things are. I would really recommend taking advantage of the broadband component of this. It's really what they're trying to emphasize. That being said, if you are going to try to potentially merge these funds with other funding sources to accomplish some larger project or service, keep in mind that may trigger all sorts of other compliance that is not applicable to these funds. So you're going to have to add all those compliance onto these funds as well. So just keep that in mind if you really want to incur that sort of responsibility with these funds. CPF reporting is going to include the entirety of the project, not just the portion of the project funded with the capital funds. So this is common with federal projects. So you are going to have, when you report, you're going to have to get more comprehensive accomplishment data or beneficiary data or whatever it is. It's going to be on the project as a whole. So keep that in mind as well. If you want to use these funds as part of a much larger project, that really could make for some laborious reporting. We don't know for sure yet. We haven't seen that guidance, but just something to keep in mind. Again, you have very limited funds, so getting the most bang for your buck is critical when it comes to that. So really look at what the greatest need is and try to serve that greatest need. That's my strongest recommendation when you have limited funds like that is what is that drastic item that you can use these funds for? You just want to be able to do the most you can. And so because there is some very specific uses for the funds combined with very limited amount of funds, kind of the strategy would be, again, if you can, try and focus on the broadband, the multi-purpose facility. Shocker, I do tons of housing work as well. But the multi-purpose facility, you can use kind of the same broad view to narrow view in order to get your project hammered out. What is the broadband shortfall? If you're looking at a multi-purpose facility, what is the service shortfall? What is this service that you're trying to provide? Then who are those that are most impacted, right? So clearly define that. Making sure it's very clear what the impacts are. Again, making sure that there's a COVID-19 tieback. So what are those impacts? Who is it impacting? Once you have that together, then how do you address it? And it may be one of those things that to address it, it's X amount of dollars. It's way too much. It's beyond the scope of what this can do. Well, is there a component within that? Is there something that can be done up front? Is there some piece of that that can be done in its entirety? You can't partially fund it with these funds. Something that you can address. So those are kind of the strategies and considerations. Keeping those in mind, some of the projects, first and easiest, and the one I would really recommend is remote learning equipment, Wi-Fi equipment, anything to get that broadband up. As we found during COVID, and the great thing is that this will allow greater resilience across a variety of potential hazards, actions, activities. the allowing for remote learning, remote working, supporting that's going to be beyond the pandemic. That's going to be if you're susceptible to hurricanes, tornadoes, any of those things where maybe those services need to be shut down temporarily. A school was damaged and the teachers are going to be teaching from home while the school's getting repaired. The students have to be from home to keep the continuity going. So, really, these items in regards to remote learning and remote working, I can't emphasize enough, that these funds are perfect for that. Provision of Wi-Fi access, definitely when it comes to underserved and lower income populations, can you provide Wi-Fi access to areas where there's concentrated lower income, densely developed areas or neighborhoods that are just underserved? When folks cannot afford broadband, it's not something that they have. The provision of Wi-Fi may be a regional or area Wi-Fi really may help a lot for those folks being able to work and school from home.
Mr. Ginga, can I interrupt for just a moment? I'm sorry. We have a hand up. Chairwoman Andrews Maltese has a question.
Sure.
Yes, and good morning. Thank you. Thank you for all this information. I know that there seems to be a heavy lean towards the broadband, and they were in the broadband process, Connecting America, I can't remember what the term was, but that had a lot of restrictions on it. This seems to be a little bit less restrictive, but it's supplemental to the broadband and the other multi-purpose guidance and leaning. But I apologize, I missed the beginning. Did we mention how much money that we're talking about overall and what the general allocation looks like? Because again, I guess it determines, especially for a small tribe like mine, there's a lot of reporting being communicated, and it seems like there's going to be, because it's restrictive and a lot of reporting, depending upon that dollar amount. And again, if it's a set amount of money shared by competitive grants, which is what we've been trying to argue against. Oh, I think I saw it. There it is. Okay. So no, that's a significant amount of money. Thank you. 167. Yeah. So it's a pretty significant amount of money for a lot of tribes. But because of all of the reporting and conditions on it, it just is a little bit disconcerting about how that's eventually going to shake out for the tribes, that we're actually having to submit competitive grants as opposed to filling out an application, which is what we had been saying to Treasury and to all the entities from Jump Street. We shouldn't be applying. We shouldn't be competitive against each other, because that's not what tribes are supposed to be doing. These are government support funds that should be allocated equally amongst all the tribes, because all the tribes are entitled to it. And it just seems like a lot of these regulations or guidance. And again, the difference between the guidance and the statutory language is problematic, because the statutory language fully embraces Executive Order 13175, particularly in policymaking, where if rules and regulations and guidance is required, deemed necessary, that the agencies are supposed to defer to the tribes, basically on a self-governance model. So I'm listening to all this and I'm like, wow, this is great. Oh, wow, this could be really cumbersome, especially because tribes, like everybody else, we are fundamentally underserved. That's a bottom line, truth. So that now that we've cleared that hurdle, now we've got all these other layers of guidance and responsibility that we have to do, which is going to be overwhelming to smaller tribes, as well as when we're looking at the timeframes and what we can and can't do with this money. It seems like it's counterintuitive and counterproductive. So I just wanted to really ask about these regulations and guidance when they were developed. Were there any, exemptions and waivers built into it with regard to the authority of the secretary? And if not, is there anything that is language that is statutorily prohibitive to say that the secretary cannot waive some of these things, because granted, all of these programs are developed not specific for tribes. They're developed specifically for all governments and nonprofit agencies or other entities that are eligible for federal dollars. And tribes are generally, I won't say an afterthought, but never really part of the development and deliberative process in the end result. And without our own separate chapter, we still get forced into that round hole as a square peg. And this is what I'm just hearing on a regular basis, not just this money, but, you know, all the money. And when I saw this extra money at the 176, where states are getting millions of dollars, and even what I think it's the 13, I can't remember the term, but it's like a agreeable territory of the United States. They're getting, you know, 3-4 times as much funding as what the tribes are getting, because there are 574 of us, but yet we still have to jump through these hoops. You know, so I just wanted to state that and get some clarity. And I do have to bounce before we're done for another forum, but it just seemed like there's still an awful lot, and the guidance of where to go that's going to be the less troublesome or the less complicated for broadband and multi-purpose buildings and supplementing. But even in my neck of the woods, $160,000, $67,000, although a very significant and very welcome and necessary dollar amount, doesn't get me anything when I'm building. You know, my cost per square foot is over $500. So the infrastructure and everything else necessary, it would be a significant contribution, but it won't get me anywhere. And the caution about combining it with other funds and to supplement, because it opens up a whole new can of worms for this money, is a little bit troubling. So if we can do another type of forum like this that has a little bit more time to drill down and see where we can get to some solutions, that would be really helpful, in case I have to leave, and I apologize for that.
Sure. No, thank you very much. And to your point, these funds for the tribal governments are being treated differently. There are already some reduction in some of the requirements. Earlier, we had discussed that their tribal governments do not need to provide the upfront planning documents that states and other awardees are getting. The funds are not competitive. There is an application process, but your money is guaranteed. Everyone's getting that total amount of $167,504. There was a whole separate page for capital funds projects specific to tribal government. There was a public process, and this is available on the website as well through the Department of Treasury, where there was and I think you were referencing this, the summary of tribal consultation that had gone out, that Treasury had done. There's a summary of that provided, and exactly to your point, was in regards to limiting the reporting and limited staff capacity, things of that nature. So yeah, it definitely appears, even though we don't have reporting requirements out, that there is going to be potentially a different process set up for tribal governments, and that there is recognition of some of those additional hurdles. So, I can't say for sure, because that guidance in regards to reporting has not been released. But it certainly appears that that's going to be the case, especially because just as an example with the ARPA SLFRF, the final rule that came out on that drastically changed a lot of the reporting requirements. I think Treasury is hearing that people want to not be afraid to use the funds and get caught in a compliance snag. And so they've been easing off on some of the reporting, some of the compliance items. Like I said, Davis-Bacon is not applicable to this, so you don't have to do any sort of Davis-Bacon wage compliance. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers what you were looking for, but it appears that when it comes to some of the compliance and reporting, that there is going to be exactly what you said taken into consideration. So,
and Chairwoman, I would add, this is Gina Bainfeld with Tetra Tech. Good morning.
Good morning.
I would add that we'd be happy to have an offline conversation about your particular projects or interest in using the funds to help you hone down. And we would offer this to any of the USET members as well, anyone on the line. So happy to help and happy to try to help make these funds work for your members.
Well, that'd be great, because one of the other challenges that we've had is the inability to find, I guess, a contractable support team to do the back of the house. And that's something that, we as a small tribe, and we, the challenges of always trying to get staff, full-time regular has always been difficult, a challenge anyway. Now, during and post this COVID impact of people reassessing their priorities in life, I'm sure I'm not the only tribe, but we're facing significant vacancies and people deciding that, hey, I can work from home, I can do something, my priorities of my life have changed. So therefore, I don't want to do this kind of work. And and if I can't work this particular way, no harm, no foul, but I'm just going to follow my own path. So finding third parties or outsourced companies or contractors to be able to assist in these back of the house to supplement the tribe's staffing issues is one area that would be, tremendous for either Tetra Tech, USET, and all these other companies that have these expertise to be able to contract out to. Additionally, with regards to the Treasury hearing us and finally making these changes, and where we started with that other money to where we're at now is wonderful. And I mean, it's leaps and bounds. However, the amount of effort and the amount of time and the amount of just downright, emotion and what we had to bring to the table in order to get us there. It took us almost a year and a half. That's a lot of time on tribal leadership to try to emphasize how important having our own door per se to go through, and then making sure that it makes its way all the way through, because we still got notifications that were applicable to states, but not to tribes. So it became very, very confusing. And that's why we said to be able to start from ground zero or Jump Street, to have it set up so that we do know this is separate for tribes. We have our own section within whatever it is, so that we don't, all the rest of it is just static and noise. It's not applicable because oftentimes the easiest default is to go back onto programs that have been developed on an antiquated system, whether or not it's an antiquated reservation system or an antiquated other type of system that's been a model used for decades, if not more, if not a century, but clearly does not fit this day and age. And there's no way that it can possibly fit the circumstances underneath this pandemic and how the tribes are trying to address the needs of our tribal members and the needs of our community. So thank you for that offer. We probably will be taking you up on it, because we're unique within Indian country because of our, dual foothold on the island and on the mainland. But it's nice to see that this is something, and I do apologize for missing the introduction where it referenced this, because the minute we saw this, I immediately went to see the comparison between tribes and what the states are getting and those territories. And, while it, like I said, while it's a significant amount of money, it's significantly less than some of the other populated, areas of the territories, and it's like, wow, man, we have tribes that have got 400,000 people, community members, and yet they're still getting this 167 when we have populations in these wonderful, beautiful territories that might have 20,000 people, and they're getting over $1 million. So, it's getting there, but it's not where we need to be. But thank you for your assistance, your guidance, and your expertise, and your offer to be able to help. And Happy New Year.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think this program does try to incorporate some of the things that the federal government has heard from tribal nations. It leaves a small amount of dollars you know, with those ears on them, but I think it's at least a good start here. There probably will be snags, but this one looks just a little easier than others, and they are trying to be a little less burdensome. We will talk a smidge about some of our capabilities right here at the end, but we'll, Eric, did you have anything else that you wanted to address in our final slide? And then we'd like additional questions.
Yeah, just very quickly, anyone who's familiar with a dig once policy, if you have an existing or maybe a planned infrastructure project coming up, you're going to be laying a new road or improving a road or anything along those lines, dig once, where you lay your fiber optic line down up front, put it under the ground, you know, looking to bury it, saves, you know, makes it much more resilient against, you know, windstorms, things of that nature. But this dig once policy, utilizing these funds for something like that to support broadband would certainly be advantageous. Exactly to the point that we've all been echoing, is that unfortunately the funds are fairly limited. To be honest, I was surprised. I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised that they were what they were. But I thought they were going to be higher. But so there are going to be some limitations because of those funds. So if you're looking at something like fiber optic, you know, that 160 something thousand, that's not going to get you many miles of fiber optic line. It'll get you a handful. And maybe if that's what you're looking for or what you need, then that's fine. But, you know, a lot of these tribal lands, there's a lot of land that needs to be covered. So, you know, just something to keep in mind that maybe there is kind of these dig once opportunities that these funds can be used for. Just two other items: upgrade your standards, your existing broadband. If it's not good enough, you can use the funds to make it good enough. So I would strongly recommend that. The other reason being is that using these funds to take care of these specific things, which a lot of folks know that there is a need for this remote learning, remote working, things like that. So this focus on broadband would then allow you to use monies that maybe have broader definitions and more eligible uses to them, that maybe you were going to have those funds go to something like broadband. Well, now this can go in and take care of that, or your multi-purpose facility or whatever it is, and then allow those funds that maybe have more flexible definitions to go to more creative, diverse, complex projects, whatever the case may be. And then lastly is that on your multi-purpose facility improvements, if you're going to look to do that, make sure that you are very clear in regards to what your COVID-related issue at the core of it, that you're addressing. Because this does have to be some sort of a COVID-19 tieback, and that question is asked in the application. So, yeah, so those are kind of the high-level project, you know, options that are kind of probably the best and easiest based on everything we've discussed. So with that, I will turn it back over to Gina and any questions.
Yeah, folks, we'd like to thank you for the questions we received beforehand. Rebecca did share those. Hopefully we've addressed them here in the presentation, but would be happy to take any additional comments or questions for discussion.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, I apologize.
From Dina Winslow at Micmac in Maine. She says, do you think that building a solar project to provide electricity would qualify for the funds?
Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, I can definitely take that. Yeah, so solar projects on tribal lands, love it. So for a project like that, you would, if you're going to be looking, so this would be for a case-by-case review. So please keep in mind that my any information I offer or recommend, it is a case-by-case review. They can accept it or not accept it for whatever whim they have. So that being said, for a solar panel project, you may be able to get it. The issue you're going to run into with your case-by-case issue is that there's a requirement on a capital funded project. If you're going to do a facility, let's see, let me go back and I'll show, I have this slide right here. That if you're going to, so that's going to be under case-by-case review, you're going to run into the trigger of, let me just jump back so we can see it on slide 9. Yep. Your projects that invest in a capital asset, the directly enable work, education, and health monitoring issue. And because they have this language about not using funds for infrastructure, I know some folks use the term infrastructure to also include utility. I do not. Infrastructure is one thing. Utility, I usually define as something separate. However, how they're going to interpret it is yet to be seen. So I think that's going to be the issue that you're going to run into, is that because they have this, they really want something that's kind of directly affecting, or if you're going to do a multi-purpose project or some sort of a capital asset, that it's really something that's addressing this impact in regards to remote access, remote learning, remote working, or actually addressing some sort of a health service need related to COVID. So in my opinion, while I love it, and I work a lot with a lot of different funding programs and finding creative ways in order to make projects eligible. So I do this a lot. I think that I would struggle with how to find a way around that enabling work, education, and health monitoring. Because it said directly. So even if it was, well, we're providing electricity that allows a hospital to yada, 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 I don't think that's a direct enough definition for what Treasury is looking for. And believe me, if there's a way I could find to fund a project like that, because I really like those projects. I've seen how much need there is on tribal lands for that, for these kind of microgrids and solar stations. I would certainly try to find a way if I could, but it's a tough one.
We have another question from First Councilman Spears from Narragansett. Our critical need due to COVID-19 is insufficient space to hold in-person tribal citizen meetings to communicate, educate, and conduct governmental business. Would this need qualify for a multi-use facility under work and education?
So it could, yes. If you're looking to expand an existing facility, a lot of folks are looking to do this. There needs to be more space in a non-COVID world. That additional space, because of social distancing, you're just trying to get more space, or more people are coming in. In the long term, it can provide other services and other benefits. So you're checking all the boxes in regards to that. The thing that you're going to have to do is, whatever this facility is, this where you want to make this addition or expansion, is that if it doesn't currently exist, you may have to add or create services that for 5 years are meeting those 3 criteria. So if those services don't exist now that are being provided at this multi-purpose site, they're going to have to be identified and set up so that this site can meet that definition. So I hope that makes sense. So if it's something like a community center, you do job training there. Maybe you do connecting workers to employers, special skills training, after school programs, maybe special reading programs, maybe a library comes and does something. And then for health services, maybe immunizations are provided through there, health for seniors, food programs for seniors. As long as you can have all three of those things being provided at a substantially, like it can't just be a token gesture. I think it needs to be something that's the facility is intended to be doing regularly. Then you would be eligible. And again, the primary function of the building does not need to be for education, work, or health monitoring. It can be something else for sure. Recreation, say the primary purpose is recreation. That's okay, as long as you're still providing those services. Yeah, and as Gina was saying, if anyone, I've worked in, as I'm sure many of you have, especially when it comes to federally funded programs, provision of services for all sorts of things, from job training and work training and education and serving special needs populations and so on and so on. So, again, if anyone would like to discuss any of what those services can extend to, we're certainly willing to have that discussion with you. I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of projects all over the country in regards to public service, things like that. So.
Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Anyone can raise their hand also, and we can unmute you and you can chat for real. There is only 10 minutes left. Do you have anything else to wrap up?
Sure. We thought, and of course, in our last couple of comments here, if you questions come up, feel free to pipe up there too. We thought what would be helpful is to tell you a little bit about Tetra Tech and some of the services and ways that we're working with tribal governments. If that's okay, just a couple minutes here, a couple of quick slides. So Tetra Tech is a leading provider of specialized management consulting and engineering. So for federal funding, compliance and administration, disaster management, and water infrastructure design. We have the claim to fame, I suppose to say. We are the nation's largest provider of emergency management consulting and planning services to state and local clients. In this graphic here at the bottom, you can see some of our key statistics. We have 21,000 staff across the country and the world, 450 offices. We work on a considerable number of projects in any given year with a little substantial over annual revenue. We also, for well over 10 years, have been ranked by Engineering News Record as the #1 water company in the country. That is by market share, also for treatment and water supply and sewer and wastewater. So in a sense, water is our roots. It's where our company started over 50 years ago, and we have expanded into many engineering, design, and grant and federal funding areas, but that's kind of where we start and what one of our key pride points is. In addition to being experts in federal funding compliance across that emergency management community resilience practice that I told you about at the outset, with several hundred employees across the company, and our grant administration services centering around federal funding, pardon me, FEMA community development block grants, and ARPA, SLFRF, CARES Act before that. We are specialized as well in providing program design and implementation, and to the chairwoman's point, staff augmentation. So for many of our clients, we are helping them design their programs to employ federal funds, making sure all the compliance and all the right structures are set in place at the outset, and then supporting their administration, whether they're running a program or whether they're making a capital investment or an infrastructure project development. So even more so than grant administrators and the sort of compliance experts, Tetra Tech is composed of practitioners. So we have been there supporting our clients in implementing programs, but also designing those infrastructure projects, those water projects, those sewer projects, those broadband projects. So have this background with our engineering expertise and over 60 sciences that can bring support and intelligence to development of a federal funding program, whether it's permitting, whether it's design, whether it's construction timeline or design timeline, environmental, the sort of whole host of doing project design and executing projects is really, I think, a key point for us. And then real important, we have a commitment to capacity building in tribal nations and tribal resident hiring. One great example of this is with our EPA response assessment and evaluation services. The RAISE contract for the Navajo Nation in addressing their abandoned uranium mines. So in any given project, we are looking for ways not only to be the consultant that comes in, provides services, but doesn't just leave without leaving something behind, without training alongside, without training segments to improve capacity, to improve understanding and compliance, and actually doing those things, as well as seeking opportunities to employ residents. So in this project in particular, we committed as part of the contract with EPA to execute a capacity building and inclusion program. And we are actively teaming with firms led by Navajo members. We are employing residents. And in this particular one, we supported grant writing to the National Science Foundation. And now we're in the second round of it to support. And those funds are being used to support Navajo University in building an environmental engineering program. One of the projects, one of the classes that we offer right now is the OSHA HAZWOPER training. It's a funky name for anyone that knows this space, but it's basically a robust training program for how to handle hazardous materials. So why we're doing this is because this, the abandoned uranium mine work is going to be there for a while. And so helping build a capacity and use it as an opportunity to benefit residents is really something that makes a lot of sense. Other projects that we have been involved in, there are too many to put on the pages, but just a sample here in brownfields, offering cleanup alternatives to the Winnebago tribe. Also cleanup and environmental investigation in these, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, the list of folks, communities here under environmental assessments. These are reservations in Southern California. Green practice accomplishments of the tribal casinos in the EPA Region 5. And as well, I saw some folks on from where we have assisted some of the tribal governments that are your members, several in hazard mitigation plans, identifying and planning for should the worst happen in the way of an earthquake, a pandemic these days, as well as natural disasters and their impacts. And those plans set the foundation to apply for FEMA funding to help implement projects that are identified. And then finally, here in the water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure space, we have assisted over 30 Native American tribes, including the folks listed here below, another member here in these various infrastructure projects. So, you know, with that, we say thank you. We are here to help and support. If there are any other questions, we'd be happy to take them. And as well, after our presentation, if there are any follow-up or some one-on-one conversations that you need, we're happy to do those as well. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Rebecca sends her apologies for not being able to stay the whole time. She had another meeting. But we want to thank you very much for presenting this great information for our tribal nations, and also for your offer of helping them. We have sent out the PowerPoint, but we will send it out again for a wrap up. And thank you so much. Everybody have a great day.